Energy markets are weighing fears that Israel could strike Iran's oil industry in retaliation for Tehran's missile attack earlier this week. For the latest on the rising tensions there, we want to bring in Meghan O'Sullivan, who is director of the Belfer Center and the Geopolitics of Energy Project at Harvard. She's a former deputy national security advisor in the George W. Bush administration and currently serves on Secretary of State Blinken's Foreign Policy Advisory Board. And thank you, Meghan, very much for joining us this morning. We're trying to make sense of what's happening right now, what the potential strikes are. How do you read this? What do you think is most likely?
Thanks, Becky. Happy to be with you this morning. I think what we're seeing is still a very large, uncertain landscape where Israel is weighing the whole span of options. We've seen already that President Biden has publicly said that the U.S. would not support strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities. But the reality is, if you're Israel, you're looking at this landscape and you're thinking about when will be a better time to take out and fundamentally change the regional balance. Right now, you have American forces and carriers in the region. You also have Israel's nemesis, Hezbollah, Hamas, other Iranian proxies on the back foot. And you have the price of oil pretty low in the markets, weak relative to what they could be. And it may be that Israel assesses that there won't be a better time in the future, particularly if this confrontation leads Iran to up its nuclear capabilities.
Meaning an attack on oil facilities or meaning an attack on their nuclear positions?
I'm talking about why the question keeps arising. Will Israel attack Iran's nuclear facilities? I think they're weighing that against, one, their capabilities, but I think we've all been taught a lesson in the last 10 days or more that it is a mistake to underestimate Iran's nuclear capabilities, and perhaps it wouldn't be a military attack of some kind. I know, of course, they're weighing other options, which include energy infrastructure, as we've seen highlighted by President Biden's off-the-cuff comments recently. And, of course, military targets are very much on the table.
Very quickly, do you consider oil attacks on the oil infrastructure there a given?
No, not a given per se. I think, and when we think about the attacks on oil infrastructure, there are two kinds that the Israelis might consider. There are many kinds, but two large. They could attack some infrastructure that's largely geared towards domestic consumption. Remember, Iran is pumping maybe 3.3 million barrels of oil a day and consuming half of that inside of Iran. So it could be domestic, it could be international, but it will almost certainly, if it comes, lead to more attacks on attacks on infrastructure around the region potentially, which is part of the reason why there's nervousness in the oil markets right now, although still less than we would expect if the oil markets were in a stronger, tighter position than they are.
The oil that they pump, that they don't use internally, most of that's going to China. Do we care if China's unhappy if something happens to that oil supply?
Well, I mean, we do care about the global economy. And of course, the oil market is a global market. So it's not as if that oil, that potentially 1.8 million barrels a day of oil that's flowing from Iran to China, if that oil is cut off or terminated for any reason, it's not just the Chinese who will be affected by the higher price. Sure. It is, of course, the whole global economy. So what could be potentially useful here is that China could be a constructive player in this in terms of trying to tamp down escalation and a potential regional war. But it just shows you that you have a lot of actors that are going to be affected. Think about the Russians. Increase in the price of oil is going to help the Russians in their war against the Ukrainians. So this is already really moving into having global implications, even before we've seen a retaliatory strike by the Israelis.
Meghan, how likely do you think it is, if Israel did go after their nuclear positions, that they would be effective in setting back Iran's nuclear ambitions?
Yeah, I think this is the big question. And frankly, I think most military analysts believe that the Israelis do not have the capability to go after, to be successfully in terms of eliminating Iran's nuclear programs. There are a variety of different places in which they could cripple some elements of the nuclear facilities. The real question, I think, to focus on is even if the strikes are not against the nuclear facilities, what are the calculations of Iran going to be? Iran clearly has to have the message that its conventional capabilities are just not up to snuff against Israel, and that Israel has the ability to change the regional calculation based on the configuration of power right now. One way that Iran can change that is by expediting or going beyond its current virtual threshold state or status as a nuclear power. And so I think that we need to be seriously concerned about whether these events, however they play out, whatever the configuration and the nature of the Israeli military action, whether this is going to push Iran into a territory where it realizes its long-held, ambitions, I think is not too strong a word, to get a nuclear weapon.